In the heart of the Pacific, there is a speck of land so remote, so isolated, that it might as well be the end of the earth. No other island lies close. No other shore rises within sight. Here, the ocean stretches unbroken for thousands of miles in every direction, a horizon without escape. And yet, on this lonely rock, humanity left behind one of its most haunting legacies, the Moai. They stand like silent sentinels, colossal faces carved from volcanic stone, gazing inland as if searching for something lost. Their expressions are solemn, their scale breathtaking, their silence unnerving. Who built them? Why do they stand here, far from the great civilizations of history? And how did a people, cut off from the rest of the world, summon the will to carve giants from the earth and raise them toward the sky? This is not a story of kings or empires, but of a fragile society perched on the edge of survival. It is a story written in waves, wind, and stone. To understand it, we must first travel to the very edge of the known world, Easter Island. Imagine the Pacific Ocean not as a vast emptiness, but as a living, breathing continent of water. Its expanse is larger than all the land on Earth combined, a shifting plain of blue stretching further than any horizon can hold. In its center lies Rapa Nui, known to the world as Easter Island, a triangular shard of volcanic rock, just 14 miles long and barely 7 miles wide. Its jagged cliffs rise like black teeth from the surf. Waves pound the stone with relentless fury, and seabirds wheel in the screaming winds. The land itself is raw, born of fire. 3 volcanoes dominate the horizon, Reno Kau in the southwest, Taravaka in the north, and Poik in the east. Together, their slopes form the island's shape, and their craters still scar the land like ancient wounds. Yet for all its dramatic beauty, this island is fragile. No coral reef guards its coasts. The soil is thin, easily stripped by rain and wind. Its forests, once lush, were never vast. There are no rivers to drink from, only rainwater gathered in volcanic craters. For the people who came here, survival would demand ingenuity, resilience, and faith. When Europeans first set foot here in 1722, on Easter Sunday, they were astonished. They had expected a barren rock, perhaps a few struggling villagers. Instead, they found hundreds of towering statues, Moai, some standing, others toppled, all carved with care and purpose. It was a revelation that shattered expectations, that such grandeur could exist on an island so small, so distant. But the Moai are not the beginning of the story, they are its climax. To understand them, we must step back into the age of seafarers, when the ocean was not a barrier but a highway. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators traveled unimaginable distances, steering by the stars, reading the currents, trusting in memory and tradition. Canoes stitched together by hand carried entire communities into the unknown. And one such voyage, centuries ago, found its way to Rapa Nui. For those first settlers, the island must have felt both promise and warning. The soil could be coaxed into growth. The surrounding seas offered fish. Palm forests reached skyward, timber for canoes and shelter. But there was also a sense of finality, no other islands lay beyond. The horizon was empty. Whoever landed here had reached the end of their world. Generations later, their descendants would build the Moai, giants of stone who would guard their clans, honor their ancestors, and embody their gods. But before the carving began, there was survival to master, land to tame, and meaning to forge in the shadow of the volcanoes. The story of Easter Island begins not with statues, but with the land itself, a land both generous and merciless, cradling a people who dared to build greatness at the edge of nothingness. And soon, that people would turn their gaze inward, toward the stone, and begin to carve the faces of eternity. The story of Easter Island does not begin with stone. It begins with sails. Picture the Pacific centuries before European maps gave it a name. Across this endless blue, Polynesian voyagers set out in double-hulled canoes, wooden cathedrals of the sea, lashed together with fiber and faith. They carried families, fire, livestock, crops, and gods, guided not by compass or chart, but by memory and the stars. At night, the sky was their map, Orion's belt pointing the way, the Southern Cross anchoring the heavens, while the feel of waves against the hull whispered direction. Somewhere in this vast migration, a fleet-sided land, a dark triangle rising from the horizon, its cliffs streaked with seabirds. To those who gazed from the canoe decks, it must have seemed like a promise from the gods. After weeks upon weeks of open ocean, here was solid ground, Rapa Nui. When their feet touched black volcanic soil, it was more than landfall. It was the end of a journey into nothingness. There was no next island. This was the edge of the world. The first settlers carried with them crops essential to life: sweet potatoes, bananas, taro, and sugarcane. They released chickens onto the earth, a portable food source across the Polynesian world. Palm forests covered the island then, their trunks rising into the sky, their leaves shimmering in the ocean wind. Timber meant shelter, canoes, and fire. Stone tools chipped from volcanic rock gave them the means to shape the land. Yet Rapa Nui was both blessing and trial. Rain fell in bursts, not steady streams, and with no rivers, the people relied on crater lakes and collected rainwater. The ocean provided abundance: tuna, swordfish, and seabirds nesting along the cliffs, but every harvest was a contest with wind, waves, and rock. This was a closed system, an island that gave only what it had, and no more. In this crucible, clans began to form. They spread across the island, each carving out territory, planting gardens, and raising families. Over time, these clans became the heartbeat of Rapa Nui life, each tracing its descent from powerful ancestors, each bound to the land that fed them. Their world was small, but their imagination was vast. They looked upon the volcanoes and craters as sacred landscapes. The earth beneath their feet was alive with mana, spiritual power. The spirits of ancestors lingered in the soil, the rocks, the wind. To thrive here was not only a matter of skill, but of balance between the seen and the unseen. And so, rituals were woven into survival. Crops were planted with offerings. Voyages to the cliffs were made with chants for safe return. The ancestors were never absent, they were guardians, and soon, the people would begin to give them form in stone. But before the chisel struck the quarry, before the first statue rose, the island had to be claimed, understood, and divided. The early centuries of Rapa Nui were about rooting life in volcanic ground and taming an island that seemed at once abundant and fragile. Each clan built its own meri, ceremonial platforms of stone, where the living and the spirits of the dead met in ritual. These sacred spaces would later grow into the great ahu that supported the Moai. Step by step, stone by stone, the foundations of Easter Island's mystery were being laid. The first footprints on Rapa Nui were not only human, they were the imprints of destiny. What began as survival would grow into a civilization defined by devotion to its ancestors, etched into the very rock of the island. And soon, as generations passed, the call of the stone itself would become irresistible. The clans would turn to the quarry, and giants would begin to emerge. The island was no longer silent. Generations after the first voyagers set foot on Rapa Nui, its volcanic slopes echoed with chants, drums, and the cries of children born into clans that now spanned the land. Villages dotted the coastlines, gardens of sweet potato cut into the soil, and chickens scratching in enclosures of stone. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile society, a deeper current was at work, an obsession with ancestry, power, and the eternal presence of the dead. At the head of each clan stood an ariki, a chief whose authority was not only political but spiritual. To lead was to embody mana, the sacred force that flowed from the gods, through the ancestors, and into the living. Chiefs carried this mana like a fire in their chest, and the prosperity of their people was thought to rise or fall with its strength. Crops, fish, even the rains themselves, these could all falter if the mana of leadership weakened. And so, the island became a stage of competing powers. Each clan sought to prove its strength, to demonstrate that its ancestors were closer to the gods, that its chief carried more mana than the rest. Power was measured not in gold or armies, but in presence, the visible weight of tradition and divine favor. The solution was stone. It began with platforms, ahu, raised along the coastlines. These ceremonial foundations, built from carefully fitted rock, became sacred thresholds where the living communed with the spirits of the dead. Upon these ahu, chiefs sought to enshrine their lineage, to root their mana visibly into the landscape. But the ahu were only the beginning. Soon, they would demand figures, faces, monuments that could embody the ancestors themselves. Thus, the idea of the Moai was born. No single clan could resist the pressure. If one chief raised a statue, another must raise a larger one. If one family carved a face, another must fashion a giant. The island became a contest of stone, a silent arms race written across the volcanic slopes. To carve a moai was no small feat. It required not only labor, but vision, the belief that a block of basalt or tuff could become the vessel of an ancestor's spirit. To the Rapa Nui, stone was not dead matter. It pulsed with mana, waiting to be shaped, waiting to be awakened. Imagine the scene at a quarry, men hammering the cliff face with stone tools, sparks of volcanic dust filling the air. The figure begins as a shallow outline, then deepens as the body emerges. Weeks turn into months as the head takes shape, the long ears, the powerful nose, the lips pressed into solemn silence. The torso stretches, arms carved along the sides, hands folded across the belly. The moai does not stand yet, it lies prone in the rock, still tethered to the earth, as if the ancestor's spirit is waiting to breathe. The work was grueling. Tools dulled quickly against volcanic stone. Food had to be supplied to the laborers, chants sung to maintain the favor of the gods. The act of carving was not merely physical, it was a sacred offering, each strike of the chisel a prayer. When the statue was free from the quarry, the true challenge began: movement. The moai had to be transported across uneven ground, sometimes for miles, to reach the ahu awaiting it. For a society without beasts of burden, without wheels, the feat bordered on the impossible. And yet, somehow, the statues walked. Every moai was a face turned inland, toward the villages. They were not meant to gaze at the sea, but at the people, watching, guarding, embodying the ancestral presence that defined Rapa Nui life. The chiefs stood beneath them as if flanked by their own lineage, legitimized by the silent eyes of stone. The island's coastline slowly transformed into a gallery of giants. Dozens of ahu lined the shores, each supporting rows of moai, each statue taller, broader, or more finely crafted than the last. To a canoe approaching from the sea, Rapa Nui must have appeared like a kingdom of watchers, a sacred citadel guarded by stone ancestors. But behind this grandeur lay tension. Each new statue demanded greater effort, more timber, more food, more hands. Clans pushed themselves to outdo rivals, and chiefs pressed their people harder, convinced that only through monuments could mana be secured. The island's fate was being written not only in the soil and the sea, but in an escalating contest of belief. For the Rapa Nui, the moai were not mere art. They were living presences, conduits of protection, power, and prosperity. To build them was to command respect. To neglect them was to risk collapse. And so, from the volcanic quarries, a chorus of chisels rang out, echoing across the valleys. Giants emerged from stone, one after another, each face a silent testimony to the ambition of chiefs, the devotion of clans, and the unbreakable link between the living and the dead. Soon, the island would be transformed into a landscape of gods and ancestors, stone rising against the sky. But with every giant raised, the burden on the land grew heavier, the demands greater. The call to stone had been answered, and it would consume Rapa Nui. High on the slopes of Raku, the quarry lies still. Today it is a silent graveyard of half-finished giants, their bodies frozen mid-emergence, their faces staring blankly from the stone as if caught between worlds. But centuries ago, this place roared with life. It was the beating heart of Rapa Nui's devotion, where rock was not merely stone but flesh to be awakened, ancestors waiting to rise. Here, the air was thick with dust and prayer. Hundreds of men labored on the cliff face, their stone chisels striking in rhythmic chorus, tapping away at the volcanic tuff. Sparks of pale rock filled the sunlight, settling into the air like ash from a fire. Songs accompanied the work, chants calling for strength, chants binding the workers to their task, chants pleading for the mana of the ancestors to flow into the statues. The quarry was a sacred place, a womb of creation. Each moai began as a shadow scratched into the cliff. Slowly, painstakingly, the outline deepened, shoulders and torsos emerging from the volcanic wall. The statues were carved lying flat, still tethered to the rock that birthed them. For weeks, months, even years, workers chipped away, sculpting massive bodies that might rise over 30 feet tall. Every blow of the chisel was an act of reverence. The people believed they were not simply shaping rock but giving form to spirits. The elongated heads, the broad noses, the solemn lips, all were more than aesthetic. They were deliberate choices, channels for ancestral power. The eyes, left hollow until the statue stood on its platform, would one day be filled with coral and obsidian to awaken the gaze of the Moai. Until that moment, the giant lay dormant, waiting. The process demanded extraordinary coordination. Tools had to be fashioned from harder volcanic stone, meals carried up the slopes, rituals performed before the day's labor began. Women and children supported the effort with food and song, while priests oversaw the spiritual purity of the work. This was not construction as we imagine it, it was ceremony on a colossal scale. The quarry itself became crowded with giants in every stage of creation. Some still fused to the cliff, others nearly freed, others standing upright in pits as workers finished their backs. To walk through Rapa at its height was to pass through a city of ancestors, each one immense, each one waiting to walk. When at last a Moai was cut free, the true marvel began, transportation. The figure, weighing many tons, had to be moved across hills, valleys, and rugged ground to reach its destined Ahu. Theories abound. Were they dragged on wooden sleds? Rolled on logs? Walked upright with ropes and human force? Whatever the method, it was nothing short of astonishing. Without wheels, without beasts of burden, the Rapa Nui coaxed these giants across miles of unforgiving terrain. The movement itself was sacred. As the statue swayed and advanced, chants rose to guide its steps, ropes strained, men shouted, sweat poured. To the islanders, this was not stone being moved, it was an ancestor walking home. At the Ahu, the Moai was raised onto its platform with ingenuity that defies imagination. Earth ramps were built, stones levered, ropes pulled with painstaking coordination until the figure stood upright. Then came the final breath, the carving of the eye sockets and the inlaying of white coral with obsidian pupils. In that instant, the Moai awoke. Its gaze turned inward, toward the clan it would guard, and the ancestor was alive once more. Along the coasts, the effect was transformative. Villages once marked by gardens and huts now stood in the shadow of titans. Row upon row of Moai lined the horizon, each facing the people, each commanding reverence. Their silence was not emptiness but authority, the unspoken weight of generations. For the Rapa Nui, these statues were not monuments of vanity. They were lifelines, spiritual sentinels ensuring prosperity. To abandon the Moai was unthinkable, to raise them was survival itself. And so the quarries never slept, the chisels never ceased, the island echoing with the labor of devotion. Yet beneath the grandeur, the strain was mounting. Each statue demanded more resources, timber for transport, food for workers, stone for platforms. The land, already fragile, began to feel the weight of ambition. The forests thinned. Soil washed away. The contest of chiefs to outdo one another drove the island's people into an ever-spiraling effort to build bigger, move farther, raise higher. Still, in those centuries, Rapa Nui must have seemed like a place of awe. An island so small, yet alive with giants. From the sea, it was a sight that defied imagination, stone ancestors rising against the sky, guardians of a people whose devotion had carved their world from volcanic rock. Rapa, the volcano of birth, was both triumph and omen. For here the island's greatest glory was created, and here, in time, its greatest burden would be revealed. The chisels of Rapa Nui had awakened giants, but the cost of keeping them standing was only beginning to show. The Moai were born in the quarry, but they did not belong there. Their destiny lay far from Rapa, on the stone platforms that lined the island's coast. To carve them was one miracle. To move them was another. For the people of Rapa Nui, this was the most dangerous, most sacred moment of all, the journey when a giant of stone would leave its birthplace and walk into legend. Imagine the scene. The sun burns over the black volcanic soil. Hundreds of men gather around a newly carved Moai, its face still raw from the chisel. Ropes of twisted fiber bite into their shoulders, wooden levers creak, and chants fill the air. A chief raises his hand. Silence falls. Then, at his command, the ropes strain and the Moai lurches forward. Dust explodes from the ground. The crowd erupts into shouts as the ancestor begins its impossible journey. How did they do it? For centuries, outsiders looked upon the statues scattered across the island and wondered. Some Moai lie abandoned along pathways, as if left mid-stride. Others rest face down, toppled before reaching their ahu. To Europeans, it seemed incomprehensible. Without wheels, without beasts of burden, how could a people so isolated move objects weighing 10, 20, even 80 tons? Theories multiplied. Some imagined sleds sliding across greased logs, whole forests felt to drag the statues inch by inch. Others envisioned rolling the moai on cylindrical timbers, like colossal barrels. Still others whispered of ropes, teams of men rocking the statues upright, making them sway side to side until they walked. But for the Rapa Nui, the answer required no mystery. The moai walked because they were meant to. With chance and rhythm, with ropes and strength, the ancestors themselves helped guide their stone bodies to their new homes. The islanders did not see stone being transported, they saw spirits returning to stand among their children. Archaeologists in the modern age have tested the theories. Experiments with replica statues show the possibilities. With coordinated teams pulling ropes on either side, a moai can indeed be made to rock forward, one step at a time, swaying like a great, drunken walker. The chant becomes the heartbeat, the rhythm of movement. To the people of Rapa Nui, it was less engineering than communion, a merging of human effort and ancestral will. The journey was perilous. The statues could crack, tip, or shatter. Each toppled moai was a catastrophe, the death of an ancestor's vessel, an insult to the clan's mana. Along the island's paths lie silent witnesses, giants that never reached their platforms, their journeys cut short. For every statue that stands upon an ahu, many more rest abandoned, frozen where fate betrayed them. Still, when the transport succeeded, the triumph was extraordinary. Imagine a moai swaying its way across miles of harsh terrain, guided by chance, hundreds of feet pressing into the earth, ropes pulling in unison. Villages awaited the arrival with ceremony, the people gathering to witness the ancestors' homecoming. And when at last the statue was raised onto its platform, the air rang with celebration. Drums thundered, fires blazed, chants echoed against the cliffs. Then came the final, sacred act. Coral eyes, with obsidian pupils, were placed into the hollow sockets. In that moment, the moai ceased to be stone. Its gaze awoke. Its power radiated across the clan. The ancestor stood again, reborn in rock, a guardian of the living. The coastline transformed into a theater of presence. Dozens of platforms lined the shores, each bearing moai of varying size and grandeur. Some stood in proud rows, watching over their people. Others towered solitary, their gazes unbroken. From the sea, the effect was astonishing, an island ringed with stone sentinels, their backs to the ocean, their faces fixed on the villages. To approach Rapa Nui was to approach a sacred fortress, guarded not by walls but by ancestors themselves. But this achievement came at a cost. Moving the moai demanded immense resources, timber for ropes and levers, manpower fed by dwindling crops, unity maintained through ritual. The island, already fragile, groaned under the burden of its people's devotion. Forests shrank, soil eroded, and tension simmered as clans competed to raise larger, more imposing statues. The moai had become more than symbols. They were the currency of prestige, the proof of a chief's mana, the heartbeat of a clan's identity. To stop building them was unthinkable. To raise ever more was inevitable. And so the mystery of movement was not merely a question of mechanics, but of belief. The statues walked because they had to. They walked because the people could not imagine their world without them. They walked because, on this tiny rock in the Pacific, greatness could only be carved in stone. The island now bristled with giants, each one an ancestor reborn, each one a reminder of the devotion and the strain that defined Rapa Nui. The sight was magnificent. The effort, relentless. But the cost of moving mountains would one day tip the balance. For as the moai walked, the forests fell, and the fragile island moved slowly toward crisis. The moai did not stand as silent stone alone. To the people of Rapa Nui, they breathed, they watched, they guarded. Each one was an ancestor returned, not a monument to the past but a presence in the present, a living channel of power. Along the coastlines, ahu platforms stretched like sacred thresholds between land and sea. Upon them, the moai stood in solemn ranks, their backs to the ocean, their faces turned inland. This was no accident. They were not protectors against foreign waves but sentinels for the villages they faced. Their gaze fell on gardens of sweet potato, on chicken pens, on families at work. Every harvest, every child's laughter, every victory of survival unfolded under the watchful eyes of stone. When the coral eyes were set into their sockets, a transformation occurred. The statue was no longer raw matter. The ancestor was awake. The gaze carried manna, the sacred force that bound the community together. Crops grew under that gaze. Seas yielded fish. Rains fell. To live outside the protection of a Moai was to live exposed, stripped of ancestral blessing. Ceremonies reinforced this bond. Priests chanted before the statues, invoking names of lineage, recalling deeds of the dead. Offerings of food, feathers, and shells were laid at their feet. Fires blazed at the ahu, smoke curling upward as prayers carried through the night. In these rituals, the living renewed their contract with the ancestors, a cycle of devotion that bound generations together. The Moai also reinforced power. Chiefs stood beneath them as embodiments of ancestral continuity. To lead was not merely to command, it was to prove that one's lineage was strong enough to raise guardians from stone. The greater the statue, the greater the prestige. Each new Moai was not only a spiritual act but a declaration of authority. Competition sharpened. Clans measured themselves against one another in stone. Along the island shores, the race for stature grew visible. Some platforms bore statues in careful rows, smaller figures joined by larger kin, generations embodied side by side. Others strove for singular giants, towering above all rivals. The message was clear: our ancestors are stronger, our chief more blessed, our mana greater. Life beneath the Moai was shaped by their presence. Children grew up beneath their shadows, told stories of the ancestors whose faces loomed above them. Farmers planted with the belief that the gaze of stone watched over the soil. Fishermen launched their canoes knowing their clans were guarded from the shore. At night, the statues loomed in moonlight, their profiles stark against the stars, as if heaven itself leaned closer to hear the voices of the living. But devotion carried demands. Statues cracked and toppled in storms or earthquakes, and their collapse was not seen as chance, it was an omen, a fracture in the relationship between clan and ancestor. Rival clans whispered that such disasters revealed weakness, that a chief's mana had faltered. The fallen Moai had to be restored, rebuilt, or replaced, lest the clan's prestige wither. Thus the guardians of stone also bound the people to endless labor. The island was in constant motion, carving, hauling, raising, repairing. The ancestors demanded presence, and presence meant toil. Each new generation inherited both blessing and burden, born into a cycle that could not easily be escaped. To stand on Rapa Nui in those centuries was to live in a landscape alive with meaning. The island itself had become a sacred theater. Volcanic quarries were wombs of creation. Forests were consumed not only for survival but for the service of giants. The coasts had become corridors of ancestral faces, rows of watchers whose silence carried weight heavier than words. The Moai were guardians, yes. But they were also chains. They lifted the spirits of the people, but they tightened the grip of chiefs. They anchored the clans in unity, but they sharpened rivalries to breaking point. For now, the statues stood proudly, their gaze unbroken, their mana unchallenged. But the balance was fragile. Behind their silent watch, the land was growing thinner, the forest shorter, the soil less forgiving. The guardians had bound Rapa Nui together. Soon, they would also test how much the island could bear. The island that once greeted its first settlers with palms swaying in the wind was changing. What had seemed like an endless resource, a forest that covered slopes and valleys, was thinning, tree by tree, log by log, until the sound of axes and fire became the rhythm of life. Timber was the skeleton of Rapa Nui's ambition. It built houses, fueled fires, shaped canoes for fishing. But above all, it moved the Moai. Without trees, ropes could not be made, rollers could not be fashioned, sleds could not slide. Every statue carved in Reno or Raku demanded the sacrifice of wood. Each new guardian raised upon the ahu was balanced against the fall of another palm. Generation after generation, the demand deepened. Chiefs pushed their clans to build ever larger statues, each one a declaration of mana, each one a challenge to rivals. Forests fell faster than they could regrow. Birds that once nested in the canopy vanished. The soil, no longer anchored by roots, began to wash away in the rains. Gardens struggled. The island's lungs were collapsing. Yet the building did not stop. It could not. The Moai were more than monuments, they were survival itself, the binding of the living to their ancestors. To halt their creation would be to admit weakness, to risk the collapse of mana. And so the people pressed on, carving larger, moving farther, consuming more of the island's fragile lifeblood. Imagine the hills stripped bare, the winds rushing across exposed earth. Villages now looked inland at statues rising higher than before, even as their fishing canoes grew scarce and their crops harder to coax from the ground. The paradox was stark: the greater the strain on survival, the greater the drive to build. The island's glory and its undoing were bound together in stone. At Reino Araku, the quarry grew ever more crowded. Hundreds of unfinished moai lay scattered along the slopes, some still fused to the rock, others abandoned mid-transport. Each one was a fragment of ambition frozen in time, testimony to the fever of devotion that swept across the clans. For the people of Rapa Nui, the signs of strain were not easily dismissed. Fewer trees meant fewer canoes, and fishing grounds became harder to reach. With soil eroding, harvests faltered, famine lurked. Clans turned on one another, accusing rivals of draining the land, of hoarding resources, of angering the ancestors with failures of faith. The statues, once guardians of unity, became markers of rivalry sharper than ever. Still, the Moai rose. The coastline now bristled with stone titans, some towering over 30 feet, their shadows stretching across villages, their faces solemn and unyielding. They were magnificent, terrifying, irresistible. They embodied pride as much as faith, power as much as devotion. To live in their presence was to feel both protected and burdened. But behind their majesty, the cost deepened. The forests were gone. The birds were gone. The island was reaching the limits of what it could give. And when an island has no more to give, the silence of its forests turns into the roar of conflict. The Moai still stood as guardians, but soon their very presence would become a spark of division. The giants that had bound Rapa Nui together were about to pull it apart. The silence of the forests had become deafening. Once, the winds of Rapa Nui whispered through groves of palms. Now, they howled across barren slopes stripped of shade. Hunger gnawed at villages. Nets could no longer reach deep waters without canoes. Gardens, battered by salt-laden winds and eroded soil, yielded less each season. And as scarcity spread, so too did suspicion. The Moai still stared toward the villages, solemn faces carved in stone, their eyes, once inlaid with coral, meant to channel the mana of ancestors. But for many, those same guardians now became symbols of betrayal. What good were the statues if the land itself was dying? What power had the ancestors if famine stalked their children? Clan rivalries, once contained by ritual, erupted into war. Bands of warriors clashed on the dry slopes, fighting not just for food but for honor. Every toppled statue became a blow against rival mana. Ahu platforms, sacred once, became battlegrounds. To tear down a Moai was to sever an enemy's link to their ancestors, to humiliate them before the island. The sound of stone crashing against earth echoed across Rapa Nui. Giants that had stood for centuries were pulled down by ropes, their faces buried in the dirt. One by one, the protectors became casualties of human desperation. Yet even in collapse, ritual continued. The Birdman cult rose from the ashes of the old order. Each year, warriors and chiefs sent champions to Orongo, a stone village clinging to the edge of a sheer cliff. From there, they descended into the sea, swimming across shark-infested waters to the island of Motu Nui, seeking the first egg of the Sui turn. The winner secured power for his clan for a year, not through Moai, but through living ritual. It was a brutal shift. The age of ancestor worship yielded to the cult of the Birdman, a faith born from scarcity, its ceremonies echoing the island's hunger for new order. Blood, risk, and danger replaced stone as the measure of power. The fall of the Moai was more than the fall of statues. It was the unraveling of a belief system, the collapse of a sacred world that had bound Rapa Nui for centuries. What had once unified clans now divided them. What had once been a promise of survival now became evidence of failure. The island, once alive with the sound of adzes and chants of builders, now carried the echo of toppled stone and the cries of battle. The faces of the ancestors, lying shattered in the dirt, bore silent witness to the turmoil of their descendants. But even as the old world crumbled, Rapa Nui endured. Its people reshaped faith, reshaped survival, reshaped their place on the island. The Moai had fallen, but the island's story was far from over. For across the horizon, sails were coming, foreign ships that would bring new faiths, new powers, and new devastations. Outsiders were about to enter the silence of the Moai. The ocean had always been Rapa Nui's prison and its protector. For centuries, no sails disturbed its horizon, no foreign voices echoed across its shores. The people lived in isolation, their struggles contained within the volcanic embrace of their island. But in the 18th century, that silence was broken. On Easter Sunday, 1722, the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen sighted land. His ships, massive wooden leviathans compared to the fragile canoes of the islanders, appeared like omens drifting from another world. When Roggeveen stepped ashore, he encountered a society scarred by scarcity and war, its great Moai already fallen or teetering on the edge of ruin. To the Dutch, the statues were marvels, inexplicable giants looming across the landscape. To the Rapa Nui, the strangers were something far more unsettling, men from beyond the sea, carrying steel, muskets, and a power that could not be explained by man alone. Curiosity met fear, ritual clashed with misunderstanding. Skirmishes broke out. Blood was spilled. And just as quickly as they had arrived, the Dutch departed, leaving behind confusion and the first cracks of a new age. Decades later came the Spanish, then Captain James Cook of Britain in 1774. Each arrival left marks deeper than the last. With every foreign ship came diseases the islanders had never known, sicknesses that swept through villages with silent ferocity. Populations already weakened by famine and rivalry now faced invisible enemies that struck without warning, eroding generations in a single season. The Europeans saw Rapa Nui not as a sacred world but as a curiosity, a puzzle of fallen giants. They recorded the statues, measured them, sketched them, yet never grasped the spiritual universe that had birthed them. To foreign eyes, the Moai were relics of a forgotten people. To the Rapa Nui, they were scars of a faith already broken. And with each encounter, the balance shifted. Islanders who once held power through ancestors or the Birdman cult now found themselves overshadowed by weapons, trade goods, and ships that could reach horizons they had only imagined. The sacred order of Rapa Nui had collapsed long before the outsiders came, but now a new, harsher reality took its place. The arrival of Europeans was not salvation. It was the beginning of another trial, one of epidemics, abductions, and foreign domination that would leave the island stripped of more than its forests. Its people, its language, its faith, everything was about to be tested in ways even the fall of the Moai had never foretold. And still, the statues stood, silent and unblinking, as sails appeared more often on the horizon. They had witnessed the rise of the islanders, the triumph of stone, the ruin of forests, the collapse of clans. Now they would watch the island meet a tide it could not resist, the world beyond Rapa Nui. The statues remained silent, watchful, their stone faces scarred by centuries, their eyes empty hollows gazing across a wounded island. Once they had been vessels of mana, guardians of the living. Now they were relics, mute witnesses to a people battered by famine, war, and the endless tide of foreign arrival. In the 19th century, the storm truly descended. The Pacific was no longer remote, no longer safe. Whalers, traders, and missionaries charted its waters, carrying with them guns, alcohol, and fates alien to Rapa Nui's shores. The island, barely clinging to survival, was drawn into the orbit of powers far greater than itself. The deadliest blow came in the 1860s. Slave raiders from Peru swept across the Pacific, seizing thousands from smaller islands, and Rapa Nui was not spared. In brutal raids, men, women, and children were torn from their homes, forced aboard ships bound for mines and plantations. Entire clans vanished overnight. Elders who carried the island's histories, priests who preserved its chants, leaders who embodied its mana, all were taken or killed. Of the few who survived captivity and returned, most brought with them new diseases. Smallpox, tuberculosis, leprosy. Sickness spread like wildfire, leaving corpses where villages once stood. The population, once in the thousands, plummeted to a handful of hundreds. Fields grew wild, houses collapsed, rituals faltered. The voices of the ancestors fell silent, drowned in grief and loss. And yet the Moai remained. Missionaries arrived soon after, their crosses rising where Ahu platforms once dominated. They brought the promise of salvation, but also the erasure of memory. Traditional carvings were destroyed, sacred sites desecrated. Oral traditions, fragile in a world where writing was absent, began to fracture. The chants that had once accompanied the raising of Moai grew faint, then faded altogether. The Birdman cult, last successor of the island's sacred order, was extinguished. Orongo's stone village fell quiet, its cliffside rituals abandoned. The god Make, once invoked with cries and sacrifice, became a shadow, his power replaced by the authority of missionaries and foreign rule. By the late 19th century, Chile claimed Rapa Nui. The island was fenced off, its people confined to a small settlement while the rest of their land was leased for sheep ranching. What remained of their freedom vanished behind barbed wire. The Moai, toppled or half-buried, lay scattered across the land like broken giants. Their silence mirrored the silence forced upon their descendants. And yet, against all odds, the people endured. Survivors clung to fragments of memory, to the few stories not erased, to whispers of chants once sung under starlight. The statues became less gods than ghosts, reminders of what had been lost and what might never return. For generations, Rapa Nui seemed destined to be a footnote in the Pacific, a conquered, forgotten land, its people reduced to curiosity, its monuments studied but not understood. Scholars argued about how the Moai had been moved, why the forests had vanished, how a society could collapse so completely. But the voices of those who lived it were gone, their truth silenced beneath the weight of colonial narratives. And still, the Moai stood. In the 20th century, archaeologists came. They dug, they measured, they restored. Slowly, some Moai were raised again, their faces lifted toward the sky after centuries of being buried in the soil. Tourism followed. The statues that had once been guardians of ancestors became global icons, magnets for travelers, symbols of human ambition and mystery. But behind their fame lies a quieter truth, the story of survival. Despite near extinction, the Rapa Nui people live on. Their language, once endangered, is spoken again. Their traditions, once suppressed, are remembered and revived. Songs, dances, and stories once nearly silenced now find voice in new generations. The silence of the Moai is not absolute. It carries echoes. Echoes of chants in the quarry of Reino Araku. Echoes of ropes straining, of drums beating, of ancestors invoked in firelight. Echoes of collapse, of war, of ships on the horizon. Echoes of a world both fallen and enduring. Today, standing before the Moai, one feels both awe and sorrow. Their scale defies belief, their presence commands silence. They are more than stone. They are memory, carved into volcanic flesh. They are warnings, reminders of ambition and fragility, of the balance between human will and nature's limits. The Moai do not speak. Yet their silence is louder than any words. It tells of a people who dreamed beyond their means, who carved gods into mountains, who turned an island into a world of giants. It tells of loss, of survival, of the price of greatness when the earth beneath you can give no more. And as the Pacific waves crash endlessly against the cliffs of Rapa Nui, the statues endure, solemn, haunting, eternal. They are the last guardians of a fallen world. The silence of the Moai is the voice of history itself.